You know, when you think of Los Angeles, the images that pop into your head are probably sunshine, movie stars, maybe the beach.
Right, the glamour stuff.
Exactly. But beneath that surface lies this long and pretty fascinating history of organized crime.
It really does.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into the story of the Los Angeles crime family, a group that, well, for over a century, quietly shaped a significant part of Southern California's underbelly.
Yeah, and we've gathered quite a range of sources for this. Everything from historical overviews to personal accounts, even perspectives from law enforcement,
hmm
to really try and understand the trajectory of this family. Our goal really is to pull out the most crucial insights, the surprising stuff.
The stuff that helps you grasp this hidden history without getting completely lost in like a mountain of dates and names.
Exactly, just the key takeaways.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. We're talking late 1800s, early 1900s.
That's right.
It sounds like even in those early Italian-American communities here in Los Angeles, the seeds were already being sown, particularly with these black hand groups.
Yeah, the Black Hand, that was sort of the precursor in many places. And what's really interesting is how quickly a family like the Matrangas rose up.
Oh, the Matrangas.
Around 1905, you see Rosario Sam Matranga becoming this central figure. The Italian community back then was largely around the plaza area downtown.
Right.
And an interesting side note, they had Arboresha origins, that's Albanian.
Oh, interesting. Not strictly Italian then.
Right, and they had this legitimate fruit vending business, which likely provided a great cover, but probably also a network and resources for their other activities.
The less legitimate ones.
Uh-huh. Threats,
Yeah.
violence, arson, extortion, this blend of legit business and, well, crime. You see that pattern again and again.
Fruit by day, extortion by night, quite the operation. And it wasn't just Sam, was it? His brothers were involved too.
Oh, yeah. Salvatore, Pietro Peter, and Antonio, Tony, they were all key parts of this early power structure.
But they didn't have total control, right? There was pushback.
Not at all. You had Joseph Ardizone, another major Black Hand figure. He challenged the Matrangas,
Okay.
and it apparently started over a dispute involving a guy named George Maizano. They even brought in someone respected in the underworld, Joseph Cuccia, to sort of mediate.
Like an arbitrator?
Kind of, yeah. And Cuccia actually sided with Ardizone, which, as you can imagine, didn't exactly smooth things over with the Matrangas.
No, I bet not.
It just ramped up the conflict. But it shows, even back then, there were these attempts at, like, internal rules or order.
But that disagreement, it led to violence, didn't it? Pretty serious violence.
Oh, absolutely. Ardizone ends up killing Maizano in 1906. Then he goes on the run, becomes a fugitive.
And the Matrangas, they let that slide.
No way.
Yeah.
While Ardizone was hiding out, the Matrangas, and allegedly it was Tony Matranga himself, they retaliated. They murdered Cuccia, the mediator.
Wow. So they took out the media.
Yep. So now Ardizone's in hiding, Cuccia is dead. The Matrangas really solidified their control after that.
And how did they keep that control?
Well, here's a key insight. They apparently started cooperating with the police.
Really?
That early. Seems so. Trading information on rivals, basically, for immunity. It shows a very early link between organized crime and, well, potential corruption in LA.
Shrewd. Definitely unethical, but shrewd.
Okay, but Ardizone didn't stay gone forever.
Nope. He eventually returned in 1914. And you can guess what happened next.
The feud reignited.
Big time. It led directly to the murders of Sam and Pietro Matranga in 1917, killed by an Ardizone ally, Mike Marino, who also went by Mike Rizzo.
So Ardizone gets his revenge.
Through his ally, yes. Now, another Matranga cousin, Tony Baccola, he got revenge for them by killing Marino in 1919.
It's just back and forth, this cycle of killing.
Exactly. But all those years of violence, it really took its toll. The Matranga family was significantly weakened by the end of it.
It sounds incredibly chaotic, just brutal. And then the 1920s roll around, Prohibition hits.
Right, and that just completely reshaped the whole criminal landscape, didn't it? Yeah, I'd imagine. Did that finish off the Matrangas?
It definitely accelerated their decline. Bootlegging brought in new players, new money, new power dynamics. And Tony Baccola, the last sort of Matranga figure trying to hold on, he disappeared in 1930. Likely murdered.
So the Matranga era basically ends there. Who fills that vacuum?
Well, into this volatile mix steps Vito Di Giorgio. He arrived around 1920, came up from New Orleans.
Okay, new blood.
Yeah, and his goal apparently was to bring some order to the LA underworld, which was still reeling from the Artisan-Matranga War.
Did he have connections?
He did, significantly, connections to Giuseppe Morello, a huge figure in the early New York Mafia. So you see these cross-country ties forming even then.
So he's trying to impose some structure, maybe link LA to the bigger picture.
Seems like it, but his time in LA was actually very short.
What happened?
He was murdered in Chicago, actually, in 1922.
Wow. So much for bringing order.
Right. But his underboss, Rosario De Simone, he took a different path. He operated much more quietly, focusing on bootlegging in LA County.
Kept a lower profile.
Exactly. De Simone actually stepped down from the top spot later in the 1920s, but he was still influential behind the scenes. It suggests a move towards maybe a more subtle kind of control.
Interesting. So different factions are still jostling. But then there's this other element. You mentioned Albert Marco in the City Hall gang. That sounds different.
It was very different. Less about traditional mafia feuds, much more about political corruption driving the whole vice scene.
How so?
Well, Marco had these deep ties into the local political machine. Guys like Kent Kane Parrott, Charles H. Crawford, they basically controlled City Hall.
Okay.
And Marco leveraged that power to become essentially the vice lord of LA in the 1920s. We're talking reports of him making $500,000 just from prostitution alone.
$500,000 back then, just prostitution.
Their control over City Hall, even parts of the press, let them run bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, everything with almost no police interference.
So in LA at that time, political connections could actually be more powerful than, say, traditional mob muscle.
For a while there, absolutely. It really highlights how political corruption sometimes just completely overshadowed the local mafia in terms of power and reach.
But that kind of setup, relying purely on corrupt officials,
Yeah.
it can't last forever, can it?
No, it rarely does. Marco got convicted in 1928. There was a big reform movement that swept through LA, and the City Hall gang basically got dismantled.
Which creates another power vacuum.
Precisely. A huge one. Suddenly, everyone's scrambling to control those incredibly profitable liquor operations that Marco and his crew had been running.
Leading to more violence, I assume.
You got it. You see guys like August Palumbo, who used to be a Marco lieutenant, getting murdered. Then Dominic DeCiola, also known as Dominic DeSoto, he takes over Palumbo's operation.
And does he last long?
Nope. Murdered in 1931. Apparently, he tried to muscle into syndicated gambling, stepped on the wrong toes. It just shows how unstable things were when power was built only on that kind of corruption.
A really turbulent time, constant shifts, brutal competition. Okay, but then Joseph Iron Man Artisan, he comes back into the picture again.
He does. Remember, he got acquitted way back in 1915 for that earlier murder, so he was technically free.
Right.
And he didn't waste time trying to reestablish his influence. He formed a really important partnership with Jack Dragna.
Ah, Dragna. Now, there's a name that becomes really significant.
Absolutely. During Prohibition, Artisan and Dragna were incredibly successful. Bootlegging, gambling, extortion. By the late 1920s, Artisan is really consolidating power again, trying to bring organized crime under his leadership.
But it wasn't totally smooth sailing, even for him. Still rivalries.
Oh, yeah. There was still tension, particularly between Dragna and Johnny Roselli, another key figure, and also Charlie Crawford, over the bootlegging rackets. Those were still hugely valuable.
Right.
But with Piccola gone and DiCiola murdered and Artisan was, suspect in both those cases,
He comes out on top.
he emerges as the undisputed boss. He even sets up this thing called the Italian Protective League. Dragna was president. Sounds legitimate maybe, but
Probably served other purposes.
probably. But Artisan's reign, the second time around, it ends really suddenly and mysteriously. In 1931, he just
Vanishes, like completely.
gone, disappeared without a trace, which in that world usually means one thing.
A permanent disappearance, like something out of a movie.
Pretty much. So with Artisan gone, the path is finally clear for Jack Dragna to take the reins. And this marks a really significant new chapter for the LA family.
Okay, so Dragna steps up in 1931. How did his leadership differ?
Well, he proved to be much more stable and ultimately, you'd have to say, more successful. He was key in making peace with the national mafia syndicate, the bigger East Coast powers.
That's important, establishing legitimacy in a way.
Exactly. And he brought his brother, Tom Dragna, in as his consigliere, his top advisor, basically. Later, his nephew, Luis Tom Dragna, got involved too, kept it in the family.
It sounds like he was good at building those national connections. The sources often call him the most successful boss the LA family ever had, right? even if they weren't as big as New York or Chicago.
That's the general consensus, yeah. He was strategic. He got the family involved in the entertainment business, which is very LA, obviously.
Wow.
And crucially, he secured a spot on the commission, the National Ruling Council of the Mafia.
Wow, that is huge.
Massive. He was the only boss west of Chicago to have that kind of formal standing nationally.
So Prohibition ends in 33. What does Dragna pivot to then?
Loan sharking became huge. Illegal gambling, too. He and John Roselli worked together really effectively to basically drive out competitors. By about 1937, they had a really tight grip on illegal gambling in the city.
And his extortion methods, they were pretty clever, apparently, not just simple shakedowns.
Yeah, the sources describe something quite sophisticated for the time. Instead of just demanding protection money, Dragna would allegedly send his own guys to rough up independent bookmakers. And then he'd swoop in and offer his protection from those very same thugs. For a cut, of course.
Wow, creating the problem and selling the solution.
Pretty much. Now, there were differing views on him. Some in the underworld apparently thought he was maybe a bit weak, but then you have someone like Mickey Cohen.
A major player later on.
Right. Cohen apparently saw Dragna as very powerful and highly respected, so, perceptions varied depending on who you were.
It definitely sounds like he was a shrewd operator.
Yeah.
And recognizing LA's different demographics, like not having that massive Italian-American population base like the East Coast, they had to recruit differently.
Exactly. They couldn't just rely on the local neighborhood talent pool in the same way. So the LA family actively recruited members from all over the country.
Bringing guys in.
Yeah, figures like Johnny Roselli himself, Vic Licata, Jimmy Frasciano, they all came from other parts of the U.S.
And they had some serious muscle too, right? Enforcers.
Oh, yeah. Frank Bompensero and Jimmy Frasciano in particular became notorious as top hitmen for the family, responsible for quite a few murders over the years.
And connections within law enforcement continued.
Yes, particularly, it seems, within the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. At the time, the Sheriff's Department had a reputation for being, let's say, more susceptible to corruption than the city police, the LAPD.
Interesting distinction. Shows they knew how to exploit local conditions.
Definitely. Adaptability was key.
But their reach wasn't unlimited. Like labor unions, they weren't as deeply infiltrated as, say, the mobs back east.
Generally, no. Their union influence seems to have been much more limited, focused on specific niches like laundromats, maybe some dress importing businesses, not the huge, powerful unions you saw controlled elsewhere.
Okay, now let's talk about Bugsy Siegel. His arrival seems like a massive deal, and maybe not entirely welcomed by Dragna.
Absolutely a major turning point. When Lucky Luciano sent Siegel out west to oversee the Syndicate's interests, it created this really uneasy partnership with Dragna.
Uneasy how?
Well, Siegel did manage to get some independent bookies to start paying tribute to Dragna, which was good for Dragna's bottom line. But there was definitely resentment. Dragna saw Siegel, backed by New York power, as encroaching on his turf.
Understandable friction. And the big flashpoint was the horse racing wire service, wasn't it? That seems crucial.
Hugely crucial. It was incredibly lucrative, controlling the flow of race results to bookies across the country. Siegel's main job was to organize this for the National Syndicate.
Did he work with Dragna on it?
Initially, yeah. They tried to take over the existing service, Continental Press. When that didn't fully work, they set up their own Transamerica.
Okay.
But then things shifted. The Chicago outfit, the big Chicago mob, they eventually took control of Continental, and they gave the entire West Coast percentage of the wire service profits to Dragna.
To Dragna, not Siegel.
That's to Dragna, which, as you can imagine, absolutely infuriated Siegel.
Oh, I bet. He probably felt cut out entirely.
Completely. It highlights those constant power struggles and shifting alliances between the different families across the country. Chicago looking out for its interests, maybe favoring Dragna over the New York-backed Siegel.
And this anger, plus Siegel apparently falling out of favor with the New York bosses over other things, like the Flamingo Casino costs, it leads to that massive underworld question, right? Was Dragna involved in Siegel's murder?
It's one of the most enduring questions, yeah. Officially, the murder in 1947 is still unsolved, but the theory that Dragna's crew carried out the hit, possibly with approval or even orders from New York, that's a very prominent theory.
Makes sense given the context. So Siegel's out of the picture, dramatically. Who steps into that void?
Siegel's top lieutenant, Mickey Cohen. And Cohen was, well, he was not about to just bow down and take orders from Dragna.
Ah, so direct conflict erupts.
Immediately. A violent, protracted conflict between Dragna's family and Cohen's crew.
Did Dragna actually try to take Cohen out? And poach his guys?
Oh yeah, very bold moves. Dragna did manage to recruit some of Cohen's Italian associates, like Dominic Brooklier, remember that name for later, and he ordered hits on other Cohen allies, some successful.
But not Cohen himself.
Cohen proved incredibly hard to kill. Numerous attempts on his life, bombings, shootings, he just kept surviving. Some compared him to Bugs Moran surviving the St. Valentine's Day massacre back in Chicago, just incredibly resilient or lucky.
Wow, so the war raged on until...
Until Cohen finally got taken down by the feds, tax evasion, in 1951. Once he was safely imprisoned, then the LA family moved right in and took over his gambling operations.
Convenient timing for them. Okay, it feels like all this violence, the Siegel murder, the war with Cohen, plus guys coming in from other cities, this must have finally gotten serious attention from law enforcement.
It absolutely did. You couldn't ignore it anymore. The high-profile hits, the corruption scandals that had even led to the recall of LA's Mayor Frank Shaw earlier, it forced the authorities to take a much tougher stance.
So a real shift in policy.
Definitely. You had California Attorney General Earl Warren launching crackdowns on Dragna's empire back in the late 1930s. He famously shut down those offshore gambling ships.
Right, the gambling ships.
And then by 1950, you have the California Commission on Organized Crime publicly naming Dragna as the head of this big crime syndicate controlling Southern California.
Putting him right in the spotlight.
Yeah.
And he had to testify at those key Felver hearings too, didn't he?
Yeah.
The ones that were televised nationally.
He did. He denied everything, of course, very vehemently. But just being called, being questioned on that national stage, it put immense pressure on him and the family.
Must have.
And while the family was still pretty powerful in the early 50s, the really big turning point for law enforcement in LA was the appointment of William H. Parker as LAPD chief in 1950.
Parker, he had a reputation for being tough.
Very tough, and specifically tough on organized crime and corruption. Under Parker, the LAPD really started to systematically go after the mob instead of the sort of patchy enforcement or even looking the other way that might have happened before.
So a concerted effort.
Yes. And you see the LA family starting to lose ground, losing influence to the bigger, more powerful Chicago and New York outfits who could maybe withstand that pressure better. Parker even formed the famous Gangster Squad within the LAPD, specifically to target Dragna and Mickey Cohen.
The Gangster Squad, right out of the movies. So the 1950s really marked the start of a serious decline for the LA family.
I think you have to say yes. The pressure was mounting, and then you had key guys like Bumpanciero and Fracciano, the muscle, getting sent to prison in the mid-50s. That definitely weakened them.
So what happens when Jack Dragna finally passes away? That was 1956, right? Must have been a crucial moment for succession.
Huge moment. And it wasn't smooth. There was apparently a contested election for boss. Frank DeSimone eventually won out.
DeSimone. Was he respected?
Well, not by everyone. John Roselli, for one, was apparently furious. He felt the election was rigged against him. Yeah. And because of that dissatisfaction, feeling pushed aside, both Roselli and Jimmy Fracciano eventually transferred their membre, their allegiance, back to the Chicago outfit.
Wow, losing two major figures like that, that's a massive blow.
Huge blow, internal conflict, loss of talent, really damaging.
And DeSimone himself. His leadership doesn't get high marks in the sources, does it?
Yeah.
Sounds like he was seen as pretty incompetent.
That's putting it mildly, yeah. The accounts paint him as really dropping the ball. There's even this, frankly, unbelievable story alleging he assaulted the wife of a former underboss, Girolamo Adamo.
Seriously?
Yeah, leading to this incredibly messy, tragic situation where Adamo and another member end up dead. It just points to chaos at the top. Essentially, the experienced guys who ran things under Dragna just became inactive almost immediately after DeSimone took over.
Total dysfunction.
Pretty much.
Okay.
And then, adding insult to injury, DeSimone gets caught up in the infamous Appalachian meeting raid in upstate New York in 1957.
Right, where all the bosses from across the country got busted by state police.
Exactly. And DeSimone, who had somehow managed to avoid any arrest record before that despite being a lawyer, suddenly gets exposed publicly as a mob boss. Terrible for his credibility, what little he might have had left.
And didn't his underboss get deported around then, too?
Yep, Simone Scazzari, deported, just problem after problem piling up.
So by the mid-60s, the LA family sounds like it's really struggling. Membership down, leadership in chaos.
Definitely a shadow of its former self. Membership reportedly dwindled significantly, especially in LA proper. They apparently still had a bit more of a presence down in San Diego for some reason.
Interesting. And DeSimone himself, he becomes paranoid.
Extremely paranoid, according to reports, so afraid of law enforcement informants that he was supposedly hesitant to even shake down gamblers anymore. Just total inactivity fueled by fear. His reign, such as it was, ended with his murder in 1967.
Another boss murdered. Okay, who takes over then?
Nick Old Man Licata.
Old man Licata. Did he manage to turn things around?
Forgot.
Revitalize the family?
Well, he tried. Licata had decent connections, ties to families in the Midwest and South, contacts in Vegas, but the landscape had changed so much. Law enforcement was much more sophisticated by then.
And they had inside help, didn't they? Informants.
Crucially, yes. Frank Bompensiero, one of their own former hitmen, had become an FBI informant. That gave law enforcement incredible insight. Plus, you had Giovellacci's public testimony about the mafia's structure nationally.
Right, the Cosa Nostra revelations.
Exactly. That pulled back the curtain for everyone. So while Luis Dragna, Jack's nephew, was actually doing well legitimately with the garment business, Licata's efforts to rebuild the criminal side were constantly hampered by intense surveillance. He even did time for contempt because he refused to testify about the LA mob's structure.
So the pressure just kept mounting. Informants, surveillance. And then Dominic Brooklier takes over after Licata dies in '74. What was his approach?
Brookley actually brought a bit of stability initially. He managed to generate income, mainly through pornography, extortion, and getting involved in drug trafficking, which was maybe a newer area for them.
Okay.
He also ordered the hit on Frank Bompensiero in 1977, once he became convinced Bompensiero was talking to the feds.
Taking out the informant.
Right. But then Brooklier himself got sent to prison in 1975 on extortion charges.
So another leadership vacuum.
Temporarily. While he was inside, Jimmy Frasciano, remember him? He'd gone over to Chicago. He actually came back to L.A. Tom Dragna apparently asked him to. And he became co-acting boss with Tom Dragna.
Fracciano's back, trying to rebuild things.
Yeah, Fracciano apparently tried to restore some of the family's standing, use his connections, but Brooklier got out of prison relatively quickly, and he immediately pushed Fracciano aside and took back full control.
Okay, so Fracciano's pushed out again, but his story takes another massive turn, doesn't it? This is where he flips.
This is the huge one. Facing potential major charges himself, related to a bombing plot back in Ohio, Fracciano made the incredibly rare decision for a man of his rank. He became a government witness.
Wow. A former acting boss turning informant. That's devastating for the family.
Absolutely devastating. His testimony, starting around 1980, was explosive. He testified against mafia figures all across the country, providing unprecedented insider details. He eventually went into witness protection.
And Brooklier, what happened to him? Fracciano must have testified against him, too.
He did. Brooklier had actually put out a contract on Fracciano's life after he flipped. But ironically, Brooklier got a relatively light sentence on the charges stemming from Fracciano's testimony. He died in prison a few years later, though, in 1984.
Okay, so after Brooklier, who's left to lead, this brings us closer to the modern era, right?
Right. Peter Milano steps up. He had been acting boss while Brooklier was appealing, then became the official boss in 1984. His brother, Carmen Milano, served as his underboss.
The Milano brothers? What were their rackets?
Pretty much the full menu by this point. Narcotics, pornography, gambling, loan sharking. They were quite active for a while.
But law enforcement hadn't given up, presumably.
Not at all. In the late 1980s, there was another major wave of arrests that really hit the family hard. And this time, the key informants were the Fiala brothers, Anthony and Lawrence. Their cooperation led to numerous convictions.
Another set of insiders turning. Really tripled them.
Dealt a very crippling blow, yeah. Peter and Carmen Milano themselves eventually pleaded guilty to various charges, but got relatively light sentences.
Light sentences again.
Yeah, which actually led some in the FBI to believe, maybe prematurely, that the mafia was basically finished in Los Angeles.
But Peter Milano got out eventually. Did he try to pick up the pieces?
He was released in 1991 and did attempt to regain control, yeah. There were reports of him trying to make moves into Las Vegas, maybe cooperating with the Buffalo crime family out there.
Still trying to operate.
Trying. But things were never the same. The murder of Herbert Fat Herbie Blitzstein in Vegas in 1997, which Milano was implicated in trying to take over rackets from, that brought renewed FBI scrutiny down on him.
So the pressure never really let up. What did the family even look like by the 90s? How many guys were left?
Estimates from that time suggest maybe only around 20 members, and many of them considered pretty ineffective, older guys, not major earners.
Just a handful, really.
Yeah.
And recruiting new blood must have been incredibly difficult by then.
Extremely difficult. As we mentioned, the Italian-American population in Southern California isn't structured the same way as back east. Fewer traditional enclaves. Plus, you have intense competition from highly organized and often much larger Hispanic and Asian street gangs and other criminal groups.
The whole landscape had changed.
Completely. There is even this weird concern noted by law enforcement about actual East Coast mafia members moving to California and potentially trying to take over what little was left of the LA racket.
Like colonization almost. Okay, so bringing us right up to recent times, is there even considered to be a boss now?
Well, the name that surfaces in reports since around 2012 is Tommaso Tommy Gambino. Not the Gambino family from New York, apparently, but a Los Angeles-based guy who's also known as a Prosecco magnate.
A Prosecco magnate.
Seriously, that's the report. Yeah. A legitimate businessman, outwardly at least. Whether he actually holds that traditional boss role is, debated.
Hard to know for sure.
Yeah.
Any other recent activity?
There was that strange incident reported in 2018. Allegedly, a Canadian gangster named Albert Iavron was inducted into the LA family, possibly as a favor to New York bosses, but then he was murdered back in Canada shortly after.
Huh. Weird. Seems more like favors and remnants than a powerful organization.
It certainly paints a picture of a family that's dramatically weakened, a far cry from the Dragna era. If you look back at the list of bosses, underbosses, consigliers over the decades,
Yeah.
you just see that clear arc, the rise, the peak under Dragna, and then this long, steady decline marked by infighting, informants, and relentless pressure.
And of course, Hollywood loves these stories. The LA mob pops up in movies and TV, right?
Exactly.
Gangster Squad.
Oh, yeah. Popular culture often gives you this romanticized or maybe just sensationalized view. The reality, as we've discussed, was often a lot more complex and, frankly, brutally unsentimental.
So wrapping up this deep dive then.
Yeah.
It's clear the Los Angeles crime family has this long, tangled history. Periods of real power, real influence, especially under Jack Dragna.
Absolutely. But then these crucial factors chipped away at them. The constant law enforcement focus, particularly from Parker onwards, the internal betrayals and conflicts, and just the changing face of Los Angeles itself, the demographics.
Yeah, all contributing to that gradual but seemingly irreversible decline.
And like we said, while it never maybe reached the sheer scale or fame of the New York or Chicago outfits,
Right.
the LA Mafia undeniably played this significant, often hidden, but very real role in shaping the criminal landscape of Southern California for, well, over 100 years.
It really did. And it leaves you with a thought, doesn't it? Considering how organized crime seems to ebb and flow and how power dynamics are always shifting in a city as diverse, as changeable as Los Angeles. What does the future look like for these kinds of groups, if anything?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Definitely something to think about.